Hi guys, this is Bison, your host, and today I've got a legendary game to show you. This one is played by former 12th World Chess Champion Anatoly Karpov, and in this game, White starts with a powerful attack right from the beginning, but Karpov defends it like a genius, and just wait till the end, you will see some insane counterattacks by Karpov himself. His opponent was a great German grandmaster, Wolfgang Uhlmann, a truly brilliant player. May he rest in peace. Alright, without wasting any time, let's dive into the game. Okay, so this game starts with the regular English opening and c5. Here Karpov goes for symmetrical variation, knight to f3, knight to f6 and knight to c3, which is called three knights variation, and if black decides to develop his another knight, then it will be called four knights variation. But instead Karpov goes for d5, directly attacking towards the center. Okay, after this takes, knight takes d5, e3, opening the diagonal for this light square bishop, and after this e6, and you can see that this is the setup of Anglo-Indian defense. And after this, white goes for d4, attacking the e5 pawn, and this complete setup is known as Queen's Gambit declined, semi-Tarrasch variation, Pillsbury variation. And now in mostly case, black usually captured this d4 pawn, but instead Karpov decides to develop his knight to c6, creating pressure towards this d4 pawn. And after this, bishop to d3. Here you can see that white is preparing to castle, and after this takes, bishop to e7. Here you can see that black is also preparing to castle, and after this, both sides simply castled. Okay, rook to e1, knight to f6, which opens the d file for this queen, and a3, okay, covering the b4 square so that black pieces can't enter. And after this, b6. Here you can see that black is preparing for bishop to b7, bishop to e3, bishop to b7 and rook to c1, taking control over this c file. So that's why here Karpov also brings his rook to c8, bishop to b1, opening the space for this queen, and you can see that white is preparing for queen to d3, targeting this h7 pawn supported by this bishop. And here Karpov decides to bring his rook to c7, which is a slight inaccurate move. It's better for black to play knight to a5 with the idea of knight to c4, targeting this bishop as well as this b2 pawn. But instead, so you can see that after this rook to c7, this allows white to play d5. And suppose if black captured this, knight to b5, attacking this rook, and obviously this rook can't go to d7 square because then white will simply play bishop to f5, which traps this rook. So that's why the only move for this rook is rook to c8. And now white cannot attack this. So now white can attack this by bishop to f5. Okay, if rook to a8, then h4. And clearly now you can see that white has these two powerful sniper bishops and a completely dominating position. But after rook to c7, instead of playing d5, so instead of rook to c7, instead of playing this move d5, here white goes for queen to d3, which is also fine because you can see that in the next move white will bring his knight to g5, which targets this h7 pawn. Okay, rook to d7, targeting this d4 pawn, queen to c2. Okay, and now comes g6, defending this h7 pawn and cutting this diagonal. Sit this diagonal. Okay, and after this bishop to a2, knight to g4. Here Karpov wants to play bishop to f6, creating more pressure towards this d4 pawn. But and the best possible way to defend this is knight to e4. But instead white decides to bring his rook to d1, and clearly you can see that he wants to push d5. But after this, Karpov takes on e3, f takes e3, bishop to f6, queen to f2, adding defense towards this d4 pawn. Okay, bishop goes back to g7. Maybe he wants to push this pawn, or maybe he wants to place his queen to this f6 square. Okay, rook to d2. He wants to create a battery. Knight to e7. Here Karpov is preparing for knight to f5. That's why white pushed his e pawn further. h6. Rook at e goes to d1 and queen to b8. Maybe he wants to bring his queen to f3, or maybe he wants to create a battery of his rooks. But white simply brings his queen to e3, a good move by white, which stops the move queen to f4, and that's why here Karpov decides to just double his rook. Okay, h3, king to h7, king to h1. Okay, now comes a6, an important move which stops knight to b5. And after this, rook to f2. Now in this position, it's better for black to just start pushing these pawns, but instead he decides to bring back his knight to g8. Maybe he wants to place this knight to f6. Okay, now white brings his rook to f1, and clearly you can see that white is creating multiple threats like knight to f5, and you can also see that these rooks are also attacking these f7 pawn. But Karpov is like a chill guy. Instead of keeping an eye toward this side, he simply just pushed his b5 pawn. For now, so here for now it's important for white to bring his knight to e2 so that it can also participate in attacking the king side. But instead white blunders by playing h4. But why? This is because this pawn on h3 is actually guarding the g4 square. But after pushing, you can see that this invites black to play knight to f6. Here it is its next destination is on g4 square, which forks this queen and this rook. And to defend this, white brings his knight to e5, defending the g4 square as well as attacking this rook. But Karpov simply takes on d4, and rook takes f6, and obviously you can't capture this rook due to knight to f7 threat which attacks this rook. So that's why Karpov firstly takes this knight by his queen, and after this rook to f7, he simply brings his rook to d7, asking for rook exchange. Rook takes d7, rook takes d7, and queen to h3, targeting this h6 pawn, but Karpov simply defends it with his rook. And after this, bishop to b1, which is an inaccurate move because keeping this bishop on this a2 diagonal is better so that it can create some pressure towards this e6 pawn. Okay, now Karpov just brings his rook to d2, targeting this d2 pawn, but h5. Okay, g takes h5, knight to d1. But again, white must consider this move bishop to a2. Okay, bishop to c6, but here black can actually capture this e4 pawn, because if white decides to pin this bishop, then white can actually capture this g2 pawn with a check and grab this rook. Okay, now queen to f3, guarding this e4 pawn as well as targeting this h5 pawn, and Karpov defends this h5 pawn with his bishop. And after this, b4. Okay, bishop to g6, and you can see that now black brings his bishop to g6 and creating some pressure toward this e4 pawn again, and white defends it with his knight. Everything was fine till here, but in this position Karpov made a mistake by playing queen to d4. Okay, so that's a mistake because you can see that this queen has no point of going to this d4 square, because you can see that this knight is perfectly defending so this knight is perfectly defended by this queen and this rook. So what's the point of playing this move? Instead of going to d4 square, he must consider the move h4, preparing for multiple threats like bishop to h5, which attacks this queen, or maybe queen to g3. Suppose from here, if a game continues like knight to g4, attacking this queen, now in this position black can actually play queen to g3, asking for queen exchange. And suppose if takes h takes g3, and look at this position of this pawn which is covering these two diagonals, and now black is threatening to play h5. So that's why white has to go back to e3 square. But after this, black can simply bring his bishop to b4, d4 by taking this knight, and yeah, you can see that now this knight can't go to g4 square, because then black will simply play h5 and trap this knight. So that's why the only square left for this knight is knight to c2. But after this, bishop to f2, which makes this rook completely useless, and you can see that this rook is trapped in the first rank. And yeah, so let's go back to our original game. Yeah, so in our original game, after the move queen to d4, knight to h3 by white, and in the next move he wants to go to f4 square, which targets this bishop. So that's why e5, which stops the move knight to f4. Okay, now white brings back his knight to f2, which is, I don't know what's the motive behind it. Okay, now Karpov brings his rook to b2, and likely he's preparing for queen to c4, which targets this rook. And here white simply brings his king further, stepping out from any danger. Okay, Karpov goes for his plan. He targets this rook, and rook goes to d1. Okay, rook to b3, and you can see that now this queen is attacked, and the best possible way to defend this is simply bishop to d3. But instead white made a mistake by playing knight to d3, and basically he blunders a free pawn, and in this position white resigned, because clearly you can see that now black is threatening to give a check from h4 square. And if suppose white exchanges the queen, then you can see that now black is threatening to capture this bishop and then this knight. And to defend this, suppose if bishop goes to c2, then simply rook takes a3, and clearly you can see that black is approx 3 points up, and he has these two powerful sniper bishops and this active rook and these two passed pawn in the queen side, which can't be stopped by white. What an amazing game by Karpov. Subscribe to my channel if you like this video. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.